Okay, remember Sodom is the lesson today. Not a lot of notes on this one, but hopefully lots of learning, but not a lot of notes. I don't know if you like that or if you don't like that, but you won't need another note page. One will be enough, I'm sure. So we've been looking at these verses, and this is the third time around on these verses, this triplet of verses that we've been going through. So we're going to read them all again. It starts in verse 5. It says, "Though you already know this, I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." And then it goes on to verse 7. It says, "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexually..." Let me start that over, because this is actually the verses we're focusing on this time. The last two sessions, we were looking at verse 5 and then verse 6. This time we're on verse 7. So let me read it again. "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire." And so that is the verse for this week, verse 7. And if we have time, I want to go a little bit into verse 8. So we're covering a lot of ground this time. 1.5 verses of Jude. But this time we're going to focus on verse 7. So if you don't have it written down, because what he's giving here are 3 examples from the Old Testament of apostates. And he's put unbelieving Israelites, rebelling angels, and depraved cities. And so the 3 sins there, I gave you a handout with this, but this will be like on the quiz, which we'll talk about the quiz after the lesson. But unbelief, rebellion, sexual immorality, those are like the 3 sins that Jude is using to show what apostasy, what can lead to apostasy. So make sure you just remember that. Unbelief, rebellion, sexual immorality. Apostasy, if you guys remember, it means to fall away or depart from the faith. So it means you knew the truth. You knew the truth about God and Christianity, or what God said, but you left it behind for something else. And these are some of the things people will leave it behind for. So they knew the truth. Maybe they either believed it or they had like a head knowledge of it, an intellectual knowledge of what the truth is, but then they departed from that and they went for something else. And so the one that we're going to focus on this week is sexual immorality. That's the third one that he says can lead to apostasy. And it reminded me of this story, because someone might say, can sexual immorality, I mean, we know it's bad, but can it lead someone to apostasy, to departing from the faith? Is it really that bad? And it reminded me of this story. An author that I like, his name's Tim Keller, and he told this story about one of his professors in college. And so he said that this college professor, he's a college pastor, a pastor associate. So he was like I'm a youth pastor, he was like a pastor to college students. So it was probably at a big church. And so a kid would go off to college and he would come back, and this college pastor would catch up with him and just want to see where he was on life. So they go out for coffee or something. They'd start talking about their spiritual lives. And if the college student, if he started saying something like, "Oh, well, I'm starting to have these doubts," maybe a philosophy class or a science class, he says, "Man, I'm starting to have these doubts. I'm not so sure if God's real anymore." The college pastor would always say, "Oh, okay, well, who are you sleeping with?" And the kid would be like, "How'd you know?" He'd say, like, "What do you..." He'd be like, "How'd you know I was doing that kind of stuff?" See, when a lot of times people will start wanting to sin, and that will often lead to them saying, "Well, how I can't sin and I can't be a Christian at the same time, so how can I get out of the Christian thing?" And they start looking for, "Oh, well, in college my philosophy professor said this or that." And they will use that as an excuse so they can continue in a sinful lifestyle. And it happens a lot, okay? It happens in all churches. Good churches, bad churches, it happens. People decide, "Oh, I don't want to follow Jesus, I want to do something else." And so that's what happens again and again at lots of churches. And so what we're going to talk about today is this story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I think most people know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's probably a story people even learn like quite young. And what happened in the Bible with Sodom and Gomorrah, even people who are not Christians, we use it in expressions. If I said something like, oh, by the time the military was done with that city, it looked like Sodom and Gomorrah. It'd be obvious what I was talking about. It would mean like it was totally destroyed, complete destruction. Or maybe someone could say something like, oh, that city, it's so filthy, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, you would know that someone meant then it was some kind of like evil or perverted, wicked city, and that's what they would mean. And a lot of times when people go to Sodom and Gomorrah, it would mean like a city full of gay people. I went to Washington, D.C. First in 2007, and then I went again in 2008, and I was just shocked. Okay, so I'm like you guys, I grew up in Missouri. It's a pretty conservative part of the country, pretty conservative area. And when I went to Washington, D.C., you'd be shocked. There are gay people everywhere, and it's really different from here. And I mean, you would just be walking around, and there's lots of like men holding hands and stuff like that. It's very different. It's very much like a culture shock. And I was joking around afterwards, and I was like, I thought I was going to Washington, D.C., not Sodom and Gomorrah, But because that's like the metaphor or whatever that I went to. It's a really different city than what we're used to here. Now, I mean, I love Washington, D.C. It's got awesome monuments and really cool stuff to see. But the people there are a lot different. And also there's like people with guns all over the place, like security guards and stuff like that, which that's not going to be like all over the country, but not everywhere's like Missouri. And you find that out. Even the word sodomy in the English language, if you ever hear the word sodomy, it comes from Sodom and Gomorrah, and it means people who do like homosexual acts. That's what sodomy means. And so even that comes from Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, and then one thing I want to point out about that verse a minute ago, it says Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns, because it did have some other towns around there. They were called Admah and Zeboim. And anyway, we won't go into that, but it's the cities around Sodom. Sodom's kind of like the main one, but these other ones that are around it, they are also very bad like Sodom. Okay, so turn to Genesis 19. We're going to go look at that story because this is what Jude's calling our attention to. So in your red Bibles there, page 9, there must be some tiny print in those Bibles. Chapter 19 is on page 9, is that right?
Yep.
Good grief. Okay, can you guys read it? That must be some tiny print. Okay. All right, so to give some background to this story, Abraham has this nephew named Lot. And I don't know if you guys know much about this man Lot, but basically Abraham and Lot, I mean, their family, they were living close to each other, but both their farms or their land, their ranches, whatever you want to call it, they were getting so big that they just couldn't kind of coexist anymore. So Abraham went to Lot and he said, well, one of us has got to move. This town ain't big enough for the two of us, but not in a mean way. And so he's like, one of us has got to move. And he gave Lot the choice. He said, Lot, do you want to stay here and make me move? Or do you want me to stay here and you move your property and all that? And Lot said, oh, I'm going to go live down by Sodom. And so that's what Lot did. And Abraham stayed where he was. Okay, so now we pick up at this story, and Lot lives in Sodom. In the chapter before this, Pastor John was actually talking about it this morning. Abraham and Sarah, they're like in a tent, and 3 men show up, and they're angels. Well, actually, one of them's Jesus. But the other 2 are angels. They show up, and Abraham and Jesus go up on a mountain, and the other 2 angels just walk off. And so Abraham and Jesus go up on this mountain, and they have a conversation about the city of Sodom. And it's pretty interesting, but we won't go into all of it because we got to move along. But basically, what Jesus says is, we're going to destroy the city of Sodom unless we can find, I think he said 5 righteous people. He says, if we can find 5 righteous people, then we will let the city remain. But God's saying, it's so wicked, we're not even going to find 5 righteous people. And so Abraham says, okay. So God sends the other 2 angels. They go down into Sodom to go investigate it and see if they can find 5 righteous people. And if they can't, they're just going to torch the city. And so that's where it picks up. So in Genesis 19, look here at verse number 1. And it says, now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And so what I want to first draw your attention to, where was Lot sitting? Where did it say he was? The gate. And the gate of the city, it's not like, it is kind of like a gate, but it's also like a platform there. And that's where people would go to like talk about maybe like court cases, or they would settle disputes there, or they'd make decisions there. And so it was kind of like an important part of the city. And that's where Lot was. So the fact that Lot was there watching the gate, it meant he was probably one of like the leadership people in this town. Probably like on the city council or something like that. I don't know if they had city councils in Sodom. But Lot was probably on it if they did. And that's why he was there at this gate. And I spoke with an archaeologist in a phone interview at the radio station a few years ago. And he had written a book about how he went and excavated this site of Sodom. And he found the gate of Sodom. And so he thought it was pretty cool because that's actually mentioned here in the Bible that Lot was there. And so he said he went and stood in the gate too. But anyway, verse 2. This is Lot speaking. He said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. And then you may rise early and go on your way." "And no," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." And angels, they always look like people. And that's why Lot's trying to be friendly to them and invite them in. I don't know if he knows that they're angels or not, but they always do look like people when they show up. In fact, you know that verse, it says, be kind to people. You wouldn't know if maybe you're entertaining an angel unaware. It means maybe a person you're being nice to, they might even just be an angel and you don't know it. So it's talking about being kind to people, but that's what Lot's doing. He's just being kind to them. He's actually entertaining an angel. But the angels don't want to stay with Lot because they have a job they need to go find. If it's like 5 or 10 righteous people, they need to go search those people out. So at this point, they only knew a Lot. They didn't know if there were other righteous people. That was kind of a pun. But anyway, verse 3, it says, "But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally.'" That's where the story gets kind of shocking. Okay, it's like, we go to this little town and we go inside the man's house, and once it gets dark, the people come out. And I think you guys all know what it means here, that they said, we want to know them carnally, okay? These are not nice people. And let's remember where we are in human history. This is 500 years after the flood of Noah, where this happened. So if you think about it, the flood was just 500 years before. God had destroyed the world just 500 years earlier because the people were so bad. And only just a few hundred years later, people are getting bad again. It only really takes 1 or 2 generations for mankind to just go downhill really bad. And so, verse 6, follow along with me. "So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, 'Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof.'" So Lot is saying something terrible here. These men are these like rapist guys. They want the angels that are inside. And he says, "Let me just give you my daughters." That's pretty. Now, to give a little bit of context to that, and it doesn't excuse it, but in the ancient East, hospitality was a really big deal. And so in the ancient East, like at this time, if you had guests over, you were always treated your guests better than you did your family or yourself. You always treated your guests better and gave them priority. And so that's what Lot's doing here. He's trying to give the angels the priority and throw his family out. But really, he shouldn't be throwing anybody out. If he's going to throw someone out, he needs to throw himself out before his own daughters. But Lot's, he had been in Sodom too long, and he'd gotten in too much of the Sodom mindset, and he had turned kind of bad. He had turned kind of wicked. But anyway, it's a bad thing that he was going to do there. Verse 9, it says, "And they said, 'Stand back.' And they said, 'This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will do worse with you than with them. And I find that verse maybe the most surprising of all, because the Sodomites out there, they're out there and they're like, well, we want to come in and rape the man. And Lot says, oh, don't do this wicked thing. And they said, you're the one who came to live with us, and now you're judging us. That's what they said. And I find that really interesting, because what is with lots of the homosexual people today, what do they often say if you want to tell them that homosexuality is bad? They'll say, hey, you can't judge me. You're not supposed to judge me. And that's often what they'll go back to, and that's what they were doing here in this story too. So people don't change is kind of the point of that. What people did in the Bible, they still do the same things today. And it said in verse 10, they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands, and that's talking about the angels. The men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. And so it's really gross. So these men have been blinded like the Sodomites. They were all stricken with blindness, and yet they're still clawing at the door. I mean, these are some pretty gross people. They're still trying to get in, but they're blind. And blinding is appropriate because people are blind today too. Verse 12, the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons and daughters, whomever you have in this city? Take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And we can see why God wants this place destroyed. And Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and he said to them, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. What do you think is going to happen to the sons-in-law? They're not taking him seriously. They think he's joking around. What's probably going to happen to them?
He's going to get stoned.
No, he's not. Well, I guess that's an idea. No, Lot's not going to get stoned. The sons-in-law are going to get left behind and torched because they weren't taking the warning seriously. I don't know if...
I think they get stoned. Isn't it fire and brimstone?
Oh, it's fire and brimstone. Okay.
So,
is that what you were referring to?
I don't think he was.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the men aren't taking him seriously, and they probably what they're thinking, oh, well, we haven't seen fire and brimstone rain out of heaven before, so it's probably not going to happen today. That's what they're thinking. It's probably like when Noah was warning people about the flood. They were probably saying, oh, it's never rained so much that it flooded the earth before. We'll be fine. We'll go up on a mountain if we need to. That's probably what they were thinking. They weren't taking the warning seriously. And people today, they might say, oh, well, there's never been raptures before. There's never been Antichrist before. And they might think that we're silly. They might think that they might not take us seriously. They might, we started to tell people there's a judgment day, that we all have to stand before God. People might not take that seriously. And so we got to live lives that back up the message behind us. The reason that they weren't taking Lot seriously is probably because they could look at Lot and they'd be like, Lot, you're complaining about the city going to be destroyed. You're the one who came to live here. You're the one who's on the city council here. You're the one that 5 minutes ago you were calling out to the people and calling them your brethren. That's what Lot called them. So they're probably thinking, you're not a moral authority here. If the city's going to get destroyed, you're probably going down with it. They're not going to take him seriously because of how he's been living his life before that. So for Christians, if we want people to take us seriously, we got to live lives that back up the message that we're trying to tell people. We need to take it seriously for ourselves before we want others to take it seriously. Okay, let's continue with the story. It says in verse 15, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him and set him outside the city. And so it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, escape for your life. And note this part, he said, do not look behind you. That's the warning of the angels. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. So he said, run away, escape to the mountains, don't even look behind you, or you'll be destroyed. And that's the warning. And That's a very important verse. Don't look behind you. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But what follows after this, it's almost kind of silly, but they say to Lot, flee to the mountains, and he gets in this little argument with them that he wants to go live in a different city instead of the mountains. It's just kind of silly because it's like, dude, these are angels. I don't know if he's figured that out yet, but he should have. These are angels, and they're saying the city's going to be destroyed, and you're running for your life, and they say, flee to the mountains, and he stops to talk about, well, I'd like to go live in this city. So Lot he likes to live in cities, apparently. He doesn't want to live in the mountain. He wants to live in the city. He won't listen to what they're saying. Just a city boy. But, that's what he wants to do, and it's just like, it just doesn't really make sense that he wants to stand and have an argument about it. But look down to verse 24. That's where we'll pick it up. It says, then the Lord rained fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew the cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. What happens to sand whenever you superheat it?
Glass.
It becomes glass, yeah.
Just
It's happened in Minecraft too.
yeah, you put it in a furnace.
Oh, okay. I haven't done Minecraft.
You haven't done Minecraft?
Well, it's apparently educational. So when you heat up sand, it turns into glass. And so something else interesting, this archaeologist that I had talked to on the phone, he said that when he excavated Sodom and Gomorrah, he dug down, and it was like a layer of glass after he dug up under there. And so it's just really interesting because it's from that night. It's from that night that it was destroyed. And he found the glass there from where the sand had just been superheated, and it just did that. So anyway, that's what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. But there's one more verse of the story I want to look at. Verse 26. It's talking about Lot and his wife here. It says, but his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And I'd like you guys to make a note of that. But that's why the angels said, do not look back behind you.
Why salt?
We're going to talk about that in a little while.
You know
Was
that.
it just like a pile or like a statue?
We'll talk about that in a little while too.
Books say different things.
Why did Lot's wife look back? Why do you think she looked back? She had too much of her life tied to Sodom. There was too much of her life wrapped up in Sodom, and that's why she looked back. And she didn't cut it off whenever God said to cut it off. She didn't listen to God's warning. She just kind of listened to her emotions, and she's thinking, oh, that city that I loved living in. And she looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And, there's this one song, and it goes, I left my heart in San Francisco. And that's kind of like what's going on with Lot's wife. She left her heart in Sodom and Gomorrah, which I found kind of an ironic, that just popped in my head, but San Francisco is kind of like the Sodom and Gomorrah of the United States of America. It's the gay capital of the USA. It really is. And they are, they are extremist freaks. They have parades, and they're literally naked in their parades. It's a wacky place. But don't leave your heart in San Francisco, that's for sure. Okay, the next part of the lesson, turn to Luke 17. Like I said, we haven't had a lot of notes on this one. Hopefully you guys are digging that. Turn to Luke 17, page 553. So there's a section in Luke 17, and Jesus is talking about his return, okay? And so he's going actually back to this story that we just read, where he's talking about his return, Sodom and Gomorrah. So when you get to 17, look at verse 24. Luke 17:24. And Jesus says, for as the lightning that flashes out of one part under the heaven shines to the other part under heaven, so also will the Son of Man be in his day. So when he comes back, it'll be like a flash of lightning. So does that mean it's going to be in stages over decades or something like that? No. When he comes back, it's an instantaneous thing. So it'll be quick, okay? But, verse 25, first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation, which of course means they'll put him on the cross. And so he'll suffer there. But when he says this generation, he's implying there that he's not bringing the kingdom to that generation. He'll be betrayed by this generation, But he's going to bring the kingdom to a different one. Hopefully it's ours. That's what I hope for. And then next, it's one of the verses that makes us believe there will be a rapture, and it's not a verse that describes the rapture. It kind of does, but it's not a verse that really describes the rapture. You go to other places in the Bible for that, but that's kind of the idea here. It's a hint of it, I think. Okay, so in verse 26, it says, this is Jesus speaking, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark." Until the day that Noah entered the ark. "And the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, he who is on the housetop and his goods are in the house, let him not come down to take them away. And likewise, the one who's in the field, let him not turn back." Okay, so I know that's a big chunk of verses there, but I want you to focus on two parts where he says, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and then later he said, but on the day that Lot went out of Sodom. And so Jesus says that the days before he returns will be like the days of Noah and Lot. Those are the two people in the Old Testament that he takes us back to. He says, that's what it's going to be like before I come back. It'll be like the days of Noah. Evil world in the days of Noah. And he said it'll be like the days of Lot. Evil city, Sodom, and the surrounding towns. Evil places. So he said it'll be evil times. But what happened before the flood that Jesus was saying there? What happened before the flood? He said that he got Noah out of it. And what happened before he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? He got Lot out of it, right? And so when he says it'll be like the days of Noah and the days of Lot, I think that's what it'll be like for us too. I think that's one of the reasons I believe in the rapture, is that he doesn't need us to go through that because we're already saved. He's not going to send the rapture. He's not going to send the tribulation on the world, the destruction of the world, until he gets us out of there, just like he did with Noah, just like he did with Lot. So God takes care of his own. I think he'll take us out first too. But the next verse after that, do you guys know the shortest verse in the Bible?
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept, yeah. This one is the second shortest verse in the Bible. So it's verse 32, still in Luke 17, but verse 32. Remember Lot's wife. Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. And you could do a whole sermon on that verse. I don't know if you could do a whole sermon on Jesus wept, but you could do a whole sermon easy on remember Lot's wife. So what does Lot's wife teach us? We'll look at verse 33. This is what Lot's wife teaches us, guys. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it or save it. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will save it. And so what's true for Lot's wife, that's true for us too. We shouldn't look back and we shouldn't say, oh, this is how non-Christians live. That looks so much better. I want to go back. I want to be like them. But it's really not what we should do. We just need to get more Jesus in our lives, if that's what we think. We shouldn't think, I love God, but sometimes I really want to go do these sinful things. Man, I wish I wasn't a Christian sometimes. Jesus is saying that you need to love him so much that those other things don't matter as much to you anymore. That's what Jesus wants us to know. He said, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. You guys know that quote? No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. It means he wants people who, once they turn to him, they aren't turning back. That's what Lot's wife did. She turned back. She's like, oh, but I miss Sodom already. And that's not what we want to do. I saw this great quote, and it was I've heard this quote a lot, but when the Teen Challenge guys came, like 2 or 3 weeks, they came on Christmas, the week of Christmas, and one of them left his Bible behind, and we took it back to him, but we opened it up to see who it belonged to, and we figured out it was one of the Teen Challenge guys, and his dad had written a note in there to his son, and it was, encouraging his son to make it through the Teen Challenge program. It was a nice little note, But he put a quote at the end, and it's this quote right here. You don't have to write it down unless you want to, but it's by Jim Elliot. He's a famous missionary. I don't think he's alive anymore. He said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he can never lose." He's no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he can never lose. I get goosebumps reading that. But he's saying to people, your soul is so precious that if you give up your soul to Jesus, you're giving it up, but you'll never lose it. And that's the best thing you can do with your soul. That's the most precious thing you have. All the money in the world would not be worth your soul. So he says that's what you should always focus on, is your soul. And also, I guess you could look at the quote, you're giving up other things in life. Give up the things that you cannot keep, but you gain heaven, something you could never lose. So it's a great quote. Since we're on the subject, Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be about gay people, homosexuals. So since we're on that subject, I want to point out one thing here in Luke 17 that maybe you guys should be aware of. I don't know if it'll ever be real important to you, but, let me go. Look at verse 34. I don't know if this will be really helpful to you or not, but it says in verses 34 to 36, he said, "I tell you, in that night there will be 2 men in one bed. One will be taken and the other will be left. 2 women will be grinding together. One will be taken and the other left. 2 men will be in the field. The one will be taken and the other left." Now, I've actually seen more than once, like people writing on the internet, and they will try to use this verse to justify homosexuality. Can you guys guess why from that verse? 2 men in a bed. Yeah. So they will. I've seen that more than once, and it makes me angry actually to think people just try to pervert the Bible like that. But that is one of the things they'll say. Well, there's 2 men in the bed. One of them was taken, so at least one of the guys must have been good, as a Christian or something. So let me explain that real quick. And there's 2 responses I have to that. One, okay, so it's 2 men in a bed. In America, we're really blessed people, and we often mostly just get our own bed a lot of the time. We're lucky enough to get our own bed a lot in this country. That's not always the case in other countries, especially in ancient times in other countries. People had to share beds a lot, and it might be to keep warm. They just didn't have all the beds that we have today. So, it's not that uncommon for there to actually be 2 men in a bed for various reasons. That would not, you would not say that and assume anything sexual was going on in that bed. And so it's just a way that people try to pervert the scripture. But also, I just want to give you something for your Bible study, something for your personal information. Look in that verse again. Look at 34. Or you could look at all of them. But what do you notice about the word men in that verse? Or if you look at verse 35, what do you notice about the word women? You notice anything in particular about that?
Sort of italicized.
Italicized, exactly. Do you guys know what it means when they italicize something in the Bible? It means that word is not in the original language when they were translating it. But, when you translate a language into another languages, sometimes you have to add words in so that it makes sense. And so, like the word men there and the word women, it actually means that's not actually in the original Greek language. It would actually just say there, that night there will be 2 in one bed, and then there will be 2 grinding together. That's all that means. It doesn't actually mean men or women, but they put that in to help us translate it into English. Anyway, make a note of that. It's just for your own. When you're studying the Bible, italicized letters in your Bible mean those words weren't in the original language. And so when it says there's 2 men in a bed, all it really says is there's 2 in a bed. It doesn't mean there's 2 gay guys in a bed, okay? That's just people, that's how people in America, when they read 2 men in a bed, that's what their mind jumps to. But that is not, they aren't thinking about the culture that it came from. Or they're trying to justify something that they know is wrong. And they're stretching scripture then. When they do that, that's a stretch. Now, I do want to show you something that actually is in the original language, still in those same verses. So Jesus had said, when he comes back, it's going to be like lightning, okay? Like a flash of lightning. So it's going to happen instantaneously. But then this is what he says is going to be going on whenever he comes back. There's going to be 2 men in a bed. What time of day are people in bed?
Night.
Right. There's going to be 2 people in the field. What time of the day do you think people are in the field?
Night.
The afternoon. And it says there's going to be 2 people grinding together. Now, do you know what time of day people would go down and grind at the mill? It was the first thing they did in the morning. Because it was like the first, they get their stuff, whatever they're grinding, I don't know enough about it. Whatever they're grinding, they would go get that done first thing. So 3 different times of the day, Jesus says, I want to return instantaneously, but there's people in bed and there's people in the field. What's going on? Okay? That's not hard for us to understand because we know that when it's like daytime in one part of the world, it's nighttime in another part of the world. And it's morning over on this part of the world, right?
Nighttime, daytime.
Nighttime, daytime. But we know that because we know that the world is round, okay? Now think about this. They didn't discover that the world was round until 500 or 600 years ago, Christopher Columbus and all that. They didn't even know the world was round back then. Back in Jesus' time. That's been discovered afterwards. So back then they thought it was all flat. But Jesus knew that it was possible for it to be night in one place and morning in one place and day in another place. Jesus knew that because, he's Jesus. So, he knows everything. But everyone else didn't know that. So that's just another proof that, the Bible is supernatural. It knows things from before its time. And I like sharing those things. I don't share those things to impress you guys or make you think that, try to convince you the Bible's true, because hopefully you already know that the Bible is impressive and true. But I share those things because, maybe someday if someone doesn't sure they can trust the Bible, you could show them something like that and show them that it's a supernatural book. And it knew things before scientists could figure them out. Scientists could tell us these things. So, let's go back to this part. Remember Lot's wife, because Emily asked a question earlier that was really bugging me and I wanted to find it out. Why was Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt? I give you maybe 3 reasons, but I'm not entirely for sure. Let me start with one that's from ancient Jewish sources, which this is from ancient Jewish sources that the Bible never quotes and that the Bible doesn't tell us to go look at. So it's probably not true, but it is in there. So ancient Jewish sources say that Lot's wife, and she had a name in it, I don't remember what it was, but she was going to fix the food for the angel guests when they came into the house, but she didn't have any salt. So she went around and started knocking on people's doors and she was complaining, oh, my husband invited these men over, I don't have any salt to fix food. And so when she ran around doing all that, that's what got the neighborhood knowing that there's these men in the house, and that's why they all show up at his doorstep wanting to rape the angels that were inside. So that's one idea. And then when she gets turned into salt, it's kind of like her just desserts or whatever. It's like she's getting what she deserved for causing all this. That's one idea. But like I said, the Bible never tells us that. It never tells us to. That's in a Jewish book called Genesis Rabbah. And the Bible never says, go look at Genesis Rabbah anywhere. So I'm not really buying that. Here's something that we do know for sure. Okay, there are so many salt piles in that region of the earth today. It's called the Dead Sea over there. Nothing grows there. There's all this salt around there. And I think she just got turned into one of those salt piles. This is what they look like. It's weird. You probably never thought that's what a pillar of salt looked like. I always just imagined that she was just frozen in place and then made of salt. She's looking back, turned to salt. But it might have looked something more like this. And it's kind of this weird statue-y thing. But here's a good explanation from the New Testament of maybe why salt. So those salt piles out there in the Dead Sea, what they actually do is they just keep stuff from growing. All they do is they keep stuff from growing, but they have no flavor. There's no flavor on them. They're very worthless salt. All they do is keep stuff from growing. They cause death in a way. They just keep life from growing, and they have no flavor. It's just worthless salt. And so Jesus talks about that a little bit. He says, he wants us to be salt. He calls us salt. But he says, be salt that enhances things. Make things better. Don't be salt that is just worthless that people would just want to throw out. And so she's kind of a picture right there of someone like a Christian who's become so much like the world that they are worthless salt now. They have no flavor. They're not enhancing anything. That's what Lot's wife turned into, because that's what she kind of did with her life. She couldn't leave Sodom without looking back. And so she just kind of became kind of like what Jesus says Christians shouldn't be. So remember Lot's wife. Be someone who enhances the world and makes the world a better place. But don't be just worthless salt that people would want to throw out. Now, if you have a dark sense of humor, I do, so I found this funny. You can get these salt and pepper shakers on Amazon.com, and one says Lot and one says Lot's wife. You want to guess which one holds the salt? Okay, so going back to Sodom, because I don't want us to just remember Lot's wife, remember Sodom. Because Sodom is what Jude is trying to make us learn a lesson about today. So what is the sin of Sodom? Turn to Ezekiel chapter 16. We're just going to look at 2 verses there. But turn to Ezekiel 16. Maybe before we look at it, what would you guys say is the sin of Sodom? In like one word. Just blurt something out. Apostasy. Well, that's a good guess because Jude's warning us about apostasy. But specifically Sodom. What was their specific sin? Most people would say, it was the rampant homosexuality going on there. The people were just out of control. Okay, that's what most people would say. I'm not saying that that's a wrong answer. But look at Ezekiel 16 and look down at verse 49. Okay, so Ezekiel 16 verses 49 and 50, it says, "Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me, and I took them away as I saw fit." So it mentions the sin of Sodom, but it lists all these other things. It doesn't even bring up homosexuality. It just lists all these other things. They didn't help the needy. And so some people are saying today, the sin of Sodom, it didn't have to do with the people there being gay. It was about this other stuff. And it's one of those things because the people who want to say that God's okay with gay marriage and living a gay lifestyle, well, they have to do something with all these homosexuality verses in the Bible. So this is what they do with Sodom and Gomorrah. They say, it wasn't about being gay. It was about they didn't help the needy. They had pride, fullness of food, abundance of idleness. So they were lazy. And that's what they'll point to. But it also says they committed abomination before me. I think that's where the homosexuality comes in. But so these people, they say, Sodom and Gomorrah, it was not against homosexuality. In this book right here that we talked about this a few lessons ago, it's called God and the Gay Christian. It tries to convince people that God's okay with homosexuality and that Christians don't have to worry about it anymore. One of the quotes from the book, he says, "They were not expressing sexual interest in Lot's guests. They were seeking to rape and possibly kill his guests as a show of hostility and dominance." So he's saying it wasn't about that they were homosexuals. It's because they were rapists. And that could be a good point that maybe it isn't about the fact that they were just gay rapists. Maybe it's just because they were rapists. That's what was so bad about them. And so that's the idea he throws out there. And it's kind of hard to counter that. Well, you could say, they were rapists. That's pretty bad stuff too. That's sexual immorality as far as I'm concerned. So maybe that's why God destroyed it, because they were rapists. Okay, how do we counter that though? We actually get our answer in the book of Jude. Well, you don't have to turn there. You can close your Bible, I think. But in Jude 7, the verse we read said, "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve an example of those who suffered the punishment of eternal fire." Now, these are some hard verses to translate. Jude's a tough book to translate. And that's why it's good to look at different translations and to kind of get the whole big picture. So I want to show you one thing. This is in the New King James Version. It's almost the same. It says, "In Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh." Up here, it just is the word perversion. But another way to say that is gone after strange flesh. And I think that's more accurate, but that kind of means the same thing. So it's not a bad translation here, but this is a little bit more literal. "They are set forth an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." Okay. So here, let me give you 4 or 5 reasons why the Sodom and Gomorrah story actually is about homosexuality from the book of Jude. Okay, strange flesh. It said they went after strange flesh, and angels are never called flesh in the Bible. They're never called flesh or strange flesh. And so the fact that these men were wanting to have sexual intercourse with the angels, if they were just trying to rape angels, the angels wouldn't be strange flesh. So it's the fact that they desire something that God did not intend for them to desire, another man. And that's why that they're strange flesh. It's something they're not supposed to go after. Second, even if we wanted to call the angels in the story strange flesh, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't know that they were angels. They just thought they were men, because that's what they looked like. Third, it would probably be more relevant for Jude to warn people against homosexual sex, because he's talking to Romans. Homosexuality was a big thing in Rome. It's probably what Jude's actually trying to turn our attention to. It's probably more relevant than trying to find angels. Fourth, the ancient Jews considered Sodom and Gomorrah to be about homosexual activity, and that doesn't mean they're always going to be right, but they're often pretty good indicators that what the ancient Jews thought of something, that's how we should understand it today too, because they knew more about the culture than we did. So that's what they thought of it. Okay, and then finally, this phrase here, and the cities around them. Okay, so this is something that was going on in all the cities. And so if they were desiring the angels were only in Sodom. They weren't in the surrounding cities. And so the sin that Sodom was destroyed for, it was something that was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah and Zeboim and all those surrounding places. It's something that was going on everywhere. There were only angels in one of the cities. So it was about the homosexual activity going on there. I only bring that up because people will try to say, well, Sodom and Gomorrah, it's not about homosexuality, it's about rapists. And that's not what it's about. It's about that they were desiring what God calls strange flesh. And so make a note about that. Jude proves that Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction was more about their homosexual activity more than anything else. Make a note about that, because I want you guys to remember that. There's so much deception going on today. That's why Jude's writing. So we would not get swept up with false teachers and their deception. Let's look at verse 8 before we go. I'm going to throw it up here on the slide. In the very same way, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies, reject authority, and slander celestial beings. Okay, it's another triplet from Jude. 3 things that these ungodly people that he's warning about, 3 things that they do. He says they pollute their own bodies, they reject authority, and they slander celestial beings. And we're just going to focus on one of those 3, and then we'll pick up next time with the other 2. So they pollute their own bodies. That's the one we're going to focus on. So polluting their own bodies. And I just want to bring it up because people who get into sexual immorality, they pollute their own bodies, okay, to great degrees. STDs, AIDS, all those kind of things. Think about Charlie Sheen. Did you guys hear about Charlie? I don't know if you guys know much about Charlie Sheen. He's been an actor for many, many years, and he recently said that he had AIDS, that he had got AIDS. And this is a guy who has for years bragged openly about all the women he sleeps with and just lots and lots of times. He's bragged about all the women he sleeps with, and now he has AIDS. You know, people pollute their own bodies with sexual immorality. And so, but to stay on this topic of what Jude is warning about with Sodom and Gomorrah and the homosexual things going on there, that homosexual activity, that is where the rates of AIDS and STDs, that's where it skyrockets, okay? That's where it is the highest. It's not hateful to say that. I mean, that's just facts. And I want to give you guys some facts because I think it's important for people to know this. This is not hateful. These are just true things. AIDS was originally called GRID, and it was stood for gay-related immunodeficiency disorder. But people thought that sounded too negative to gay people, so they changed the name. But that's originally, everyone knew that's what it was about. Okay, gay people are 17 times more likely to get certain kinds of cancer. 78% of new AIDS infections each year are in gay men. 75% of syphilis infections each year are in gay men. 78% of gay men have had at least 100 partners in their lifetime. A fourth will say more than 1,000. 79% will say that over half their partners are strangers. Out of the gays who've gotten married or say they're in a committed relationship, only 4.5% say they stayed faithful. And their average lifespans are 20 years shorter. For gay people, their average lifespan is 20 years shorter. And why is that? It's like it said in that verse. They pollute their bodies. Now, listen, smoking will take 10 years off somebody's life. Being gay will take 20 years off. But if you say that even today, people will tell you you're being hateful. You want to help somebody. You don't want them to be in that kind of lifestyle, but they'll tell you you're being hateful just for giving the facts. But I want you guys to know the facts because the world wants to squash out the truth. Just a few weeks ago, there's a doctor in Boston, and he was fired because he would tell people not to engage in homosexual activity. And he had all these stats. This doctor was a urologist, and that's a doctor who deals with like the going to the bathroom body parts. So he's a urologist, so he knows what he's talking about. And he'd tell people, we shouldn't be encouraging people to live a gay lifestyle because it's killing their bodies, and he sees all the effects that it's having on them. And they fired him because he would not say that it's okay to be gay, because he was always talking about the massive healthcare risks. And here's a quote from him. He said, "It indicates a peculiar willingness to overlook high-risk behaviors common to the LGBT community, which is contradictory to the larger mission of healthcare institutions to promote and model healthy choices and lifestyles." So he's saying, we're supposed to be helping people get healthier, and we're doing the exact opposite. And he lost his job for that, for telling people the truth. And so that's the world that we're in. They want to squash out the truth. A couple other things. This couple in Oregon, they were ordered to pay $130,000 because they would not bake a cake for a gay wedding. $130,000. They were told it was being discriminatory not to bake a cake for the wedding. Last week in New York, this is a new law in New York City as of last week. Okay, think about this. If someone comes in who's a man and wants to use the women's restroom, okay, you go up to him. This is a real law. Go look this up. This happened in New York a week or two ago. So a man comes into your store and he says, where's the women's restroom? I'd like to go to the bathroom. You say, well, sir, you can't use the women's room. You have to use the men's room because you're a man. Okay, once you say that, if you keep him from going to the women's room that he wants to go to, you can be fined up to $250,000. $250,000. Now, if you refer to him still as a sir after that, after he's told you he identifies as a woman and wants to use the women's restroom, if you still refer to him as sir or use the word he to describe him or call him a man, you can be fined up to $250,000. If you even say to him, because let's say he says, well, I identify as a woman. I'm a man, but I identify as a woman. If you say to him, well, can you give me some sort of evidence or proof so that I know you're not some kind of like pervert who's trying to go in and, go into the women's room and look at naked women, or go into a women's locker room and look at naked women. I need to know you're not just some kind of pervert, that you actually identify as a woman and can prove it. If you ask for any kind of proof, you can be fined up to $250,000. So that is the world that we live in now, guys. It's in New York, in places like New York. And Washington passed a similar law this year too, Washington State. So guys, this is the world we live in. It's not like that in Missouri. We're lucky, but it's going to come this way. And so we need to be ready, and we need to tell people the truth, okay, no matter what it costs us. The law is trying to force people to lie and say, oh, well, I actually think you're a woman. And the law should not be allowed to force people to say things that they don't believe are true. And so we need to stand up for our rights. That's coming. But actually what I want to end with, even though it can feel like we're in a war with Sodomites today, that's why I'll call them Sodomites, because Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where it comes from. We can feel like we're in a war with them. But we got to remember that anybody can be delivered from that lifestyle. They can be saved. They can be cleansed. All that. Jesus can save anybody. And so we got to remember that they're not our enemy. It can feel like we're at a war with them, but we're not our enemy. Satan's the one who wants to destroy their soul. We want them to get saved. But remember, Jude is telling us is what the world will be like right before Jesus comes back. That's what Jude's trying to tell us. what the world will be like right before Jesus comes back. And it's interesting that, he talks about unbelief, rebellion, and sexual immorality. But it's interesting that the example of sexual immorality he goes to is homosexuality. And that's such a big thing for our day. And so that's what he goes to, though. So it's very timely. I think it's near that time that Jesus is about to come back as lightning flashes from the east to the west.